third session of this faith group study, Influence and Intrigue, the role of women in Israel's history. Based on the limited amount of information available in the Bible, we're seeking a picture of women's experience in the Old Testament. We started with Sarah, the first woman in the Bible with any kind of extensive story. And then last time, Pastor Dave considered Rebekah, Isaac's wife, and Abraham's great niece. In the ancient world, marriage within the clan was highly valued. They had no concept of the genetic problems that could result from intermarriage. Now, to her credit, Rebekah trusted God's promise that Esau would serve Jacob, even though he was older. To her discredit, she plotted to get Isaac's blessing for Jacob by cruel deceit. In fact, Esau was so angry that he threatened to kill his brother. And so Rebekah told Jacob to flee, to go back to their home territory up by Haran. And that led Jacob to encounter two more fascinating biblical women. As with Abraham's servant, when he met Rebekah, Jacob met Rachel at a well. That was a natural community gathering place for pastoral people in a dry climate. Rachel tended the flocks of her father, Laban, and so she came to water them. And for Jacob, it was love at first sight. Don't really know how Rachel felt about him. But again, the fact that they were first cousins was considered a benefit, not a problem. But for most of human history, love had very little to do with marriage. Marriage was about social stability and procreation. It was regulated far more by contract than by emotion or even personal commitment. If you loved your spouse, that was a bonus. Icing on the cake, but it certainly wasn't considered essential or necessary. Well, that meant, in order to marry Rachel, Jacob had to win over her father, Laban. And the result was one of the greatest battles ever between con men. Remember, Jacob's name means supplanter or deceiver. And he was well earned. He got Esau to sell him his birthright, and then later cheated Esau out of their father Isaac's blessing. But in Laban, Jacob nearly met his match in deception and manipulation. Now we must note here one other reality that is very unpleasant for modern readers, and that is that women were considered to be the property of their fathers, then their husbands, and then their oldest sons. If Jacob married Rachel, it would cost Laban something of value. And so a marriage agreement was actually pretty close to a sales contract. As before, we don't have to like that, but we can't deny that that's the way it was. Well, one sign of how smitten Jacob was with Rachel was the very generous offer he made to Laban. He would work for him for 7 years at no pay, just room and board, in exchange for marrying Rachel. Well, Laban jumped on a deal like that and made the agreement. And the result is probably the most romantic verse in the entire Bible. Genesis 29:20 reads, Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her. Aw, isn't that sweet? What a guy. I mean, he is totally Twitter-pated. And maybe because of that, Jacob hadn't yet taken the full measure of Laban. Because, as you know, Laban had another older daughter named Leah. Now, in Genesis 29:17, some English translations read that Leah's eyes were lovely. But that Hebrew word is obscure, and almost surely a better translation is that her eyes were weak. And that's a problem if, as is likely, women wore veils most of the time. It meant that her eyes and her figure were the only indications of her beauty. Rachel, meanwhile, is described as graceful and beautiful in form. Does that imply that Leah was not? Text doesn't say. But it does clearly imply that Rachel was a great beauty and poor Leah was a plain Jane. But now recall from session 1 that having children was a woman's whole reason for being in the view of the ancient world. Not getting married wasn't an option for even the plainest Jane. So what's a father like Laban to do to marry off his older daughter, Leah? Cheat. In Genesis 29:22, Laban schedules the marriage feast for Jacob and Rachel. But in verse 23 it reads, "In the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her." Well, how'd Laban pull that off? Well, it's because the bride was brought to her husband heavily veiled. And they spent their wedding night in a tent without windows or lights. As long as Leah didn't speak, Jacob was none the wiser. And in fact, in verse 25, his shock is pretty clear. When morning came, it was Leah! Ah! How'd that happen? And in verse 26, when Jacob challenged Laban about it, he offered the lamest of lame excuses. But the deed was done. The marriage was consummated. And there was no sense of annulment or being able to go back on it. It was a horrible, dirty trick for Laban to play on Jacob and Leah. Even if it did mean he had managed to marry off his older, unlovely daughter. And again, Leah had no say in the matter, but like Hagar and Abraham, she may have seen this as a way out, a way to assure her future and give meaning to her life. In any case, once the marriage was consummated, they couldn't undo it. And so Jacob ended up with a wife he didn't want. Leah married off to a husband who didn't love her. It was a tragic outcome, and it would last for their entire lives. Meanwhile, Laban offered Rachel to Jacob again for another 7 years of working for him. And Jacob took the rotten deal, which again just shows how profoundly he loved Rachel. Now, that actual wedding took place just a week later. But Jacob was on the hook to keep serving his crooked father-in-law for another 7 years. So can you even imagine what a mess Jacob's household must have been? Leah is unloved. Rachel must have resented this bigamous situation with her sister that she never bargained for. Jacob despised Laban. And I have to think he could have cut the tension with a knife every hour of every day. Just because of that, though, we find a marvelous note of grace in the text. Genesis 29:31 reads, "When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." Now, procreation, like marriage itself, was largely a practical affair. Despite not loving Leah, Jacob still had many children with her. And this gave Leah's life meaning and purpose and great value. Psalm 113 reads, "The Lord gives the barren woman a home, making her the joyous mother of children." Well, that applies to the emotionally barren, like Leah, not just physically barren. That does not, however, imply that God punished Rachel by making her barren. The text doesn't credit her barrenness to God at all. But the fact that she couldn't conceive surely must have been humbling to Rachel, tamped down any pride or haughtiness she may have felt over against her sister. It certainly kept her from looking on Leah with contempt, the way that Hagar had looked down on Sarah. Still, this was a dysfunctional and unhealthy family situation. In fact, in Genesis 30, starting at verse 14, Leah is reduced to bribing Rachel in order to sleep with Jacob, her husband. We can only have compassion for how Leah's life turned out. Yet we also thank God for having mercy on her. Now, Rachel, on the other hand, turned out to be her father's daughter. In a great text, she conned the old con man with exquisite deception. After serving Laban for 14 years, Jacob had had more than enough. And so he asked Laban to release him so that he could go back to where he had come from, back to Canaan. Now, he also happened to rob Laban of the cream of his crop on the way out the door. But it's really hard to blame him. Laban richly deserved it, given how badly he had treated him. In fact, if you want to look at Genesis 30, 25 to 43, you'll find an early primitive exercise in animal genetics, which is how Jacob managed to rob Laban blind. Well, Laban kept delaying letting Jacob go because Jacob had made him filthy rich. So finally Jacob left anyway, while Laban was away from home shearing his sheep without his permission. And that presented two serious problems. The first is that under the laws of that day, Leah and Rachel still belonged to Laban. Despite their marriage to Jacob, they could not leave without his permission. And so Jacob either had to stay with Laban or risk losing his wives and the mothers of his children. The other problem was that on her way out the door, Rachel stole the household gods. Now, the technical name of these are the teraphim, and they were understood to bless and oversee the life of the home. We can see that polytheism and animism was still present among God's people. And losing the teraphim to Laban, he would have assumed it would bring disaster on his household. And so Laban chased after Jacob and caught up with him. Frankly, he was much more concerned about the teraphim than he was about his daughters. And he accused Jacob of stealing him. Meanwhile, Jacob had no idea that Rachel had, in fact, stolen them. And so in Genesis 31 and 32, Jacob swore to Laban, "Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live." Talk about dramatic tension. Jacob just unwittingly put Rachel, his beloved wife, under a death sentence. But Rachel had learned from the best how to run a sting. Laban was searching everywhere in the tents to find his household gods, but in Genesis 31:14, it reads, "Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them." But then further, in verse 35, she told Laban, "I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." She had to stay seated because she was having her period. Now, there's every reason to think that wasn't actually true. She just lied shamelessly. Again, she learned from the best. But it was a brilliant move for two reasons. In the context of the story, it precluded Laban from finding the teraphim. But there's also a second layer of meaning for the readers of this text later on. The law of Moses deemed any kind of bodily discharge to be defiling. It also sharply forbade idolatry, because of course there is only one true God. So later Jewish readers could see nothing more fitting or deserved than for Rachel to defile these idols by sitting on them when she had her period. She escaped the consequences of Jacob's reckless vow, and she treated the idols exactly as they deserved to be treated. Rachel was one sharp operator, but you can hardly help but admire her. More importantly, Jacob also gave the teraphim the treatment they deserved. Once they got back to Canaan, he reached Bethel, where he had had the dream of the ladder running between heaven and earth. And there Jacob gathered all the teraphim from his household and buried them at the base of a tree. And from then on, he and his household worshipped only one God, the one true God of Israel. Well, Leah ended up being blessed with 6 sons by Jacob and at least one daughter, Dinah. There were other daughters born to Jacob, but none of them are named in the Bible. And Rachel, too, was eventually blessed with 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Tragically, she died during hard labor giving birth to Benjamin. And that's another important insight into the lives of ancient women. Childbirth was essential for them, yet also one of the most dangerous things they could undergo. In fact, that remained the case until very recently in historical terms. And in fact, Jacob's grief for Rachel, his blatant favoritism for her sons over against his other children, really drives the last cycle of stories in Genesis that all center around Joseph. But however strained and difficult their lives were, somehow Leah and Rachel coexisted and even thrived. God used them and their offspring to carry the covenant forward to the next generation. And so in spite of all the tragedy and the dysfunction and the dishonesty in their lives, Leah and Rachel in some ways are living proof of the promise in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Well, enjoy some discussion in your small groups now. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.